The woman in cell 7 isn't the most dangerous thing on this station, the old dispatcher whispered through the static. It's what made her stop speaking. The transmission cut out before Ethan Cole could answer. His shuttle drifted through freezing plasma fog toward Chiron, 9 Frontier Station, a rusted metal structure hanging above a dead moon nearly 40,000 miles from the nearest trade route. Red warning lights pulsed across the hull like a dying heartbeat. Half the station windows were dark. The other half flickered weakly against the endless black. Ethan adjusted the collar of his weather-worn thermal jacket and stared through the cockpit glass. He had spent 11 years working frontier security for colonies most people on Earth had never heard of, but something about Chiron 9 felt wrong before he even docked. Maybe it was the silence. Stations were never silent. There were always engines humming, voices over comms, cargo drones rattling through corridors. But as the docking clamps locked onto his shuttle with a heavy metallic groan, the only sound was static crackling through his earpiece. Station control. Ethan spoke calmly, grabbing his duffel bag. This is Officer Ethan Cole requesting clearance confirmation. No response. Just static. The airlock hissed open slowly, releasing a blast of cold recycled air that smelled faintly of ozone and burnt wiring. Ethan stepped inside. The corridor lights flickered overhead in uneven pulses, painting the walls in dim red flashes. One of the ceiling panels sparked near the far end of the hall. His boots echoed across the steel floor as he moved deeper into the station. Then he saw the scratches. Long marks carved across the metal walls beside the security checkpoint. Not random damage. Desperate damage. Ethan stopped near the front desk. An overturned coffee mug rested beside an old terminal covered in dust. The screen still glowed faintly. 12 employee files remained open. Every profile had the same status stamped across it in bright yellow letters. Deceased. Ethan exhaled slowly. Hell of a welcome. A low mechanical hum suddenly echoed through the corridor behind him. He turned instantly, hand hovering near the stun pistol at his belt. An old maintenance drone rolled out of the shadows, dragging one damaged wheel behind it. Its cracked voice box sputtered to life. Warning. Cell 7 containment breach reported. Warning. Cell 7 containment breach reported. Ethan frowned. Containment breach? The drone's lens flickered toward him. Last assigned guards failed to maintain subject compliance. Subject. The machine paused for 2 full seconds before answering. Valeth. Even the name sounded heavy inside the empty station. Ethan moved toward the central security room. The automatic doors struggled before sliding open halfway. The smell inside hit him first. Burnt circuits. Cold air. Old fear. Security monitors covered the walls, most of them blacked out or frozen with static distortion. One screen still worked. Cell 7. Ethan stepped closer. At first, he saw only darkness behind the reinforced glass. Then 2 golden eyes opened slowly from the shadows. Not glowing. Reflecting. Watching. The woman sitting inside the cell was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, even while seated. Blue-black skin shimmered faintly beneath the dim emergency lighting. Heavy restraint cuffs wrapped around her wrists and neck, connected to the wall by thick magnetic chains. White scars crossed one shoulder like faded lightning. But it wasn't her size that made Ethan freeze. It was her expression. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. The woman tilted her head slightly as if studying him. Then, in a quiet voice roughened by disuse, she finally spoke. You're the 13th one. The lights flickered again. Somewhere deeper in the station, something metal slammed shut. The station lights dimmed for nearly 3 seconds before emergency power kicked back in. In that brief darkness, Ethan heard chains move softly somewhere beyond the reinforced glass. Not aggressive. Careful. Like someone adjusting their weight after sitting still too long. He kept his eyes on the monitor. Valeth had not moved from the corner of the cell, but the golden reflection in her eyes never left him. You should not stand that close to the glass, she said quietly. Ethan folded his arms. Why? You planning to break through it? A faint sound escaped her throat. It almost resembled a laugh, though there was no humor in it. If I wanted out, this station would already know. Ethan studied her more carefully now that the shock had worn off. The reports described her as unstable, violent, impossible to contain. But the woman on the screen looked exhausted more than dangerous. Her dark silver hair hung loose around her shoulders, uneven like somebody had cut it with a utility blade months ago. The heavy restraint collar around her neck had rubbed the skin raw beneath it. One side of the cell wall carried old burn marks where emergency shock systems had clearly been overloaded. He glanced toward the station records terminal beside him and tapped the screen awake. Personnel logs flooded across the monitor. 12 guards assigned over 14 months. 12 removals. No details listed beyond fatal containment incident. Ethan frowned. Convenient paperwork. Valeth tilted her head slightly. They never tell the whole story. Before Ethan could answer, a loud metallic bang echoed somewhere above the security deck. Dust drifted from the ceiling panels. The old maintenance drone immediately rolled backward into the corner, repeating the same warning in its damaged voice. Structural instability detected. Structural instability detected. Ethan grabbed a portable flashlight from the desk and checked the power level on his sidearm out of habit. 83% charge remaining. Not ideal. Does this place always sound like it is falling apart? Valeth stared at him silently for a moment before speaking. Only during storms. As if on cue, the station groaned around them. Outside the reinforced observation window, blue plasma clouds twisted across the blackness of space like glowing ocean currents. Ethan had read about the storms surrounding this moon. Electromagnetic interference strong enough to disrupt navigation systems and short out older station hardware. Chiron 9 was practically abandoned because of it. Which raised another question. If this station is barely functional, Ethan said slowly, why keep you here at all? Valeth's eyes lowered toward the floor. For the first time. Because nobody wants me anywhere else. The answer lingered heavily in the room. Ethan leaned back against the console. He had heard that tone before. Soldiers after failed deployments. Refugees on mining colonies. People who had spent too long being treated like a problem instead of a person. He tapped through another set of files. Medical reports. Transfer requests. Psychological evaluations. Nearly every page had entire sections blacked out by command authority. One document remained partially visible. Subject V. 12 exhibits extreme responses to physical contact. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Another line followed beneath it. Recommended interaction minimization. He slowly looked back up at the monitor. Valeth was watching him again. Waiting. What happened here? Ethan finally asked. For several seconds, she said nothing. The station hummed quietly around them, while distant thunder rolled through the metal framework from the plasma storm outside. Then Valeth spoke so softly he almost missed it. The first guard asked me the same thing. Ethan felt the air in the room grow colder. And her golden eyes dimmed slightly beneath the flickering red light. He stopped asking after the third night. Somewhere deep in the station, an alarm suddenly began to pulse through the corridors. Slow, hollow, like a heartbeat waking up. The alarm continued pulsing through Chiron, 9 in slow intervals, low enough to vibrate the floor beneath Ethan's boots. He moved through the security room toward the main corridor, flashlight beam cutting through drifting dust particles in the cold air. Behind him, the monitor still showed Valeth sitting motionless inside Cell 7. Watching. Always watching. What does that alarm mean? Ethan asked without turning around. Her voice came through the speaker overhead a moment later. Storm pressure damaged the lower sectors. Ethan stopped beside the half-open doorway. You sound pretty calm about that. This station has been dying for a long time. Something about the way she said it made the words feel less like observation and more like experience. Ethan stepped into the corridor. The emergency lights flashed red. Across rows of old security lockers lining the walls. Most hung open and empty. One still contained a jacket with a faded station patch stitched onto the shoulder. Chiron Frontier Detention Authority. He brushed his fingers across the dust coating the fabric. The material felt stiff from months of cold air and neglect. Nobody had touched this place in a very long time. Another metallic groan echoed through the station, followed by a brief flicker in the ceiling lights. Ethan glanced toward a maintenance map mounted beside the elevator shaft. Lower storage sectors. Auxiliary power rooms. Medical wing. Half the station had already been sealed off from structural instability warnings. He muttered under his breath. They sent one guy to babysit a collapsing prison in the middle of nowhere. Not a prison. Valeth's voice corrected quietly through the nearby intercom speaker. Ethan looked up at the camera mounted above the hall. Then what is it? Silence answered him at first. Then came a soft mechanical click from the speaker system. "You should see the lower level for yourself." Ethan hesitated only briefly before grabbing a thermal flashlight from the wall rack and heading toward the maintenance elevator. The old lift shuddered violently as it descended through the station's interior framework. Rusted cables groaned overhead while warning lights flashed across the control panel. Level 3 restricted. Ethan kept one hand near his sidearm anyway. Years on frontier worlds had taught him that abandoned places usually hid the truth better than active ones. The elevator doors opened halfway with a loud scraping sound. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the smell of old antiseptic and burnt circuitry. Ethan stepped carefully into the dark hallway beyond. The beam from his flashlight swept across overturned medical carts and cracked observation windows. Most of the room's signs had been removed, but one label remained partially attached beside a reinforced door. Behavioral Compliance Unit. Ethan frowned. Compliance. The word tasted wrong. He pushed the damaged door open slowly. Inside, the room looked less like a medical facility and more like something designed to erase people quietly. Thick restraint frames lined the walls beside shattered monitoring equipment. One examination chair still sat under a hanging surgical light, leather straps dangling loosely from the armrests. Ethan's flashlight moved toward the far corner where old data drives were stacked beside a broken terminal. The moment he touched the terminal screen, archived footage flickered weakly to life. Grainy security recordings filled the monitor. Cell doors, guards, hallways. Then another video opened automatically. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Valeth stood in the center of a white observation room surrounded by armed personnel. She looked younger in the footage, less hollow. One technician reached toward the restraint collar around her neck. Instantly, her entire body recoiled. Not aggressive, terrified. The footage ended abruptly in static. Ethan stared at the frozen screen for several seconds. Outside the room, thunder rolled through the station again. Then the intercom beside the door crackled softly. "Now you understand," Valeth whispered. Ethan looked toward the speaker. "No," he answered quietly. "I think I am only starting to." The cafeteria freezer still worked. Barely. Ethan stood inside the dim storage room with cold vapor curling around his boots while old refrigeration fans rattled overhead like loose bones. Rows of supply shelves stretched through the darkness, half empty except for military ration packs and sealed water containers covered in frost. Somebody had stopped restocking this station months ago, maybe longer. He grabbed 2 nutrient packs and a thermal flask from the shelf before the lights flickered again. Every few seconds, the entire station seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The plasma storm outside was getting worse. As Ethan stepped back into the corridor, the distant hum of the force field generators pulsed unevenly through the walls. Cell 7 sat at the far end of the detention wing beneath a row of flickering red lights. Quiet. Too quiet. Ethan slowed his pace as he approached. Through the reinforced glass, Valeth remained seated against the wall exactly where he had left her. Her chains hung heavily from the magnetic. Restraints bolted into the floor behind her. She looked almost carved from shadow beneath the emergency lighting. But her eyes shifted immediately toward the bag in Ethan's hand. "Food?" she asked cautiously. Ethan stopped outside the cell controls. "You sound surprised." Valeth stared at him for a moment before answering. The others usually forgot. Something tightened quietly in Ethan's chest. He crouched near the access panel and scanned the security settings. Standard procedure required armed supervision, shock restraints, and remote food insertion through the lower slot beneath the barrier. He looked at the instructions for several silent seconds before muttering, "That explains a lot." Valeth tilted her head slightly. "What are you doing?" Ethan pressed a manual override key. The small food slot beneath the force field unlocked with a mechanical hiss. "Feeding someone." He slid the thermal flask and ration pack carefully through the opening. Valeth did not move immediately. She watched him first, her expression unreadable beneath the dim red glow. Then slowly, almost uncertainly, she reached forward and picked up the water container with both hands. Ethan noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. She drank carefully, like somebody trying not to waste a single drop. Outside the station hull, thunder rolled through the plasma clouds again. The lights dimmed harder this time. For one terrifying second, the force field surrounding Cell 7 flickered transparent. Valeth froze instantly. Her entire body stiffened as her eyes darted toward the unstable energy barrier. Ethan saw the fear before she buried it again. Then the shield stabilized with a sharp electric crackle. Silence followed. Valith lowered the water slowly. You should not stand so close when the field weakens. Ethan leaned back against the opposite wall. You keep warning me. Because you are not behaving like the others. The answer came so quietly that it barely sounded intentional. Ethan studied her across the corridor. Up close, the exhaustion in her face looked worse than before. Dark shadows rested beneath her golden eyes. The restraint collar around her neck seemed slightly too heavy for the already thin frame beneath it. Whatever she had once been before this station, Chiron 9 had spent a long time trying to erase it. He opened one of the old station files on his datapad again. Valith, he said carefully, what species are you? She looked down at the untouched ration pack in her lap. Does it matter? Maybe. A long silence stretched between them while distant machinery hummed somewhere deep inside the station. Finally she answered. The Solari Dominion. Ethan frowned slightly. Even on Earth, people knew that name. The Solari were not pirates or raiders. They were diplomats. Scientists. One of the oldest civilizations in mapped space. That does not make sense, he said before he could stop himself. Valith's eyes lifted toward him again. Sadness flickered there for only a second. No, she whispered. It does not. Then, for the first time since Ethan arrived on Chiron 9, the station lights went completely dark. Darkness swallowed the detention wing so completely that Ethan could hear the station before he could see it. Pipes ticking somewhere behind the walls. Ventilation fans slowing down one uneven rotation at a time. The distant growl of plasma thunder vibrating through the metal structure around them. Then came another sound. Breathing. Slow. Controlled. Much closer than before. Ethan kept perfectly still beside the cell door, one hand resting near the flashlight clipped to his belt. Emergency power should have restored the backup lights within 3 seconds. It had already been nearly 20. Valith, he said quietly into the darkness. No answer came immediately. Then her voice emerged somewhere beyond the dead force field. Closer now. Do not move. Ethan's muscles tightened instinctively. That usually means something bad is about to happen. A faint metallic sound echoed near the floor. Chains. He realized suddenly what the darkness meant. The restraint systems were offline. Before he could react, emergency lights snapped back to life in a violent red pulse. Ethan blinked hard against the brightness. Valith stood less than 6 feet away on the other side of the transparent barrier line where the force field should have been. Active. One broken restraint chain still hung loosely from her wrist, dragging across the floor beside her. She had not crossed the threshold. She could have. Instead, she remained standing perfectly still, shoulders tense, golden eyes locked onto the hallway behind Ethan. Ethan slowly turned. The maintenance drone sat motionless near the corridor entrance, sparks jumping weakly from its damaged shell. Beyond it, a heavy blast door had partially opened during the power failure. Cold air rushed inward from the lower sector tunnels carrying dust and the sharp smell of ozone. The storm knocked open the lower seals, Valith said quietly. This station was not maintained properly. Ethan looked back at her. And you stayed inside the cell. Something unreadable passed across her expression. You brought me water. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Red emergency lights pulsed softly across the corridor walls while distant thunder rolled through the hull again. Ethan finally crouched beside the damaged force field generator mounted near the floor. Burned circuitry. Overheated relays. Old repairs layered over older repairs. I can patch this temporarily, he muttered. But the system is barely holding together. Valith watched him carefully. You are trying to keep me inside. Ethan glanced up from the panel. I am trying to keep this station from venting atmosphere into space. A faint flicker touched the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. More like surprise at hearing something honest. Ethan removed the toolkit from his belt and started reconnecting the damaged relay cables manually. Sparks crackled briefly against his gloves. The force field flickered weakly back into existence between them, glowing pale blue now instead of white. Temporary power only. There, Ethan exhaled. That should hold for a few hours. Valith lowered herself slowly back against the far wall of the cell. The exhaustion in her movements looked deeper now, harder to hide. Ethan noticed her untouched ration pack still sitting near the corner exactly where she had left it. You did not eat. Her eyes lowered briefly. The nutrient blend contained sedatives. Ethan froze halfway through sealing the maintenance panel. Excuse me. Valeth reached down carefully and turned the ration package so he could read the faded chemical label printed across the back. Compliance Supplement 7A. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. He grabbed the packet through the lower slot and scanned the ingredients list under the red light. Neural suppressants. Metabolic stabilizers. Dosage indicators meant for long-term detainees. His stomach turned cold. They were drugging you. Valeth leaned her head back against the steel wall behind her. It made me easier to transport. Ethan stared at the label for several silent seconds while the station groaned around them. Then slowly, very carefully, he placed the ration pack back through the slot and slid his own emergency protein bar beside it instead. Valeth looked down at the small silver wrapper like she had forgotten what kindness looked like. The storm finally reached full strength an hour later. Chiron 9 trembled like an old ship caught in deep ocean waves while blue plasma clouds rolled across the station windows in flashes bright enough to turn the corridors white for half a second at a time. Ethan sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor outside Cell 7 with a toolkit beside him and a half-disassembled power relay spread across his lap. The temporary force field flickered weakly every few minutes now. Barely stable. Across from him, Valeth remained near the back wall of the cell, though the silver wrapper from the protein bar lay empty beside her. Ethan noticed it immediately, but chose not to mention it. Some victories were quieter than others. The station lights dimmed again. Somewhere overhead, loose ventilation panels rattled violently. Ethan tightened another relay connection before wiping grease across the sleeve of his jacket. I have a question. Valeth looked toward him carefully. Humans usually ask many. Why did they call you V12? Silence settled between them for several long seconds. Outside the station hull, thunder rolled through space in low vibrations that hummed beneath the floor. Finally, Valeth spoke. Because numbers are easier to lock away than names. Ethan leaned back against the wall slowly. He had expected anger from her, maybe bitterness, but every answer she gave sounded tired instead, like someone who had already spent too long carrying memories alone. What was your real job before this place? He asked. Valeth's golden eyes shifted toward the storm outside the observation glass. I was a navigator. Ethan blinked once. That is it. A faint flicker crossed her expression again. You expected warrior stories. The files made you sound terrifying. The files were written by frightened men. Another silence followed. Ethan glanced down at the cracked relay in his hands while the red emergency lights pulsed softly across the corridor. You know, he muttered, back on Mars Colony 6, they once wrote a report saying I had discipline issues. Valeth tilted her head slightly. Did you? Ethan gave a tired shrug. Depends who you ask. To his surprise, a quiet sound escaped her throat again. Softer this time. Real amusement. The station hummed around them while the storm continued raging beyond the hull. For the first time since arriving on Chiron 9, Ethan realized the detention wing no longer felt quite as cold. Then suddenly every light in the corridor flashed bright white. Warning alarms erupted instantly afterward. Pressure breach detected in lower maintenance sectors. Pressure breach detected. Ethan shot to his feet. The force field around Cell 7 flickered dangerously weak again. He grabbed the nearest wall console and scanned the alert data. One of the storm seals failed. Valeth stood immediately inside the cell. The lower tunnels connect to the reactor intake. Ethan's stomach tightened. If the pressure drop spreads upward, this whole deck loses oxygen. He started moving toward the emergency locker at the end of the corridor, pulling a breathing mask from the wall cabinet as he passed. Behind him, Valeth stepped closer to the unstable barrier line. Ethan. He stopped. It was the first time she had used his name. He turned slowly back toward her. Red light reflected softly across her dark skin, while warning sirens echoed through the detention wing. You cannot repair the lower seals alone, she said quietly. Ethan looked at the broken restraint chain still hanging beside her wrist. Then at the unstable force field failing between them. Probably not, he admitted. Another violent tremor shook the station hard enough to throw dust from the ceiling panels. The force field crackled weakly one final time before collapsing completely with a sharp burst of sparks. Silence followed. No barrier. No restraint strong enough to stop her now. Valeth looked at the open corridor beyond the cell entrance for several long seconds. Freedom stood only a few feet away, but instead of running, she slowly lifted her eyes back toward Ethan and asked the question almost like she was afraid of the answer. Do you still trust me? The station shook again hard enough to bend one of the overhead light panels loose. Sparks rained briefly into the corridor before dying against the cold metal floor. Ethan steadied himself against the wall and looked directly at the open cell entrance where Valeth stood motionless beyond the dead force field. No chains, no barrier, just silence between them. Do you still trust me? She asked again, quieter this time. Ethan glanced toward the corridor leading to the lower maintenance sectors where warning alarms still echoed through the station. He should have been afraid. Every report he had read told him to be afraid. 12 guards gone. Extreme containment warnings. Psychological instability markers stamped across every file. But none of the reports mentioned the way she stayed inside the cell even after the door opened. None of them mentioned how carefully she handled a bottle of water like kindness itself was unfamiliar. Ethan exhaled slowly. Right now, he said, I trust you more than whoever built this place. Something shifted in Valeth's expression then. Not relief exactly. More like disbelief struggling against hope. Another warning siren pulsed through the station. Ethan snapped back to the problem at hand and grabbed 2 emergency breathing masks from the wall cabinet. He tossed one carefully toward her. Valeth caught it instantly without looking away from him. Fast. Precise. Years of instinct. Hidden beneath exhaustion. The lower seals are failing, Ethan said while securing his own mask around his neck. I need to shut the pressure vents manually before this deck loses atmosphere. Valeth stared at the breathing mask in her hands for a moment, like she had forgotten what it meant for someone to give her something without expecting obedience in return. Then she slipped it over her face and stepped fully out of Cell 7 for the first time. Ethan noticed immediately how carefully she moved. Not predatory. Cautious. Like someone expecting the floor beneath her feet to disappear. The broken restraint chain dragged softly behind her with each step across the corridor. Together, they moved toward the maintenance elevator while the storm battered the station around them. Red emergency lights flashed across the walls in slow pulses. The old elevator groaned heavily as Ethan forced the doors open manually. You know your way around the lower sectors? He asked. Valeth stepped inside beside him. Better than most guards ever did. The elevator descended through the station with violent shudders every few seconds. Ethan watched the floor numbers flicker downward through layers of damaged decks and abandoned storage zones. Level 4. Level 5. The lower they traveled, the colder the air became. Finally, the doors opened into near darkness. Freezing wind rushed through the hallway carrying loose papers and dust across the floor. One of the outer maintenance seals had ruptured halfway open, exposing the corridor to partial vacuum pressure. Warning lights blinked weakly near the far wall. Ethan immediately moved toward the damaged control console. I need 5 minutes. Valeth's golden eyes scanned the dark corridor beyond him. You may not have 5. Ethan followed her gaze. Shapes moved faintly at the far end of the tunnel. Maintenance drones. 3 of them. Their damaged optics glowed dim red beneath layers of dust as they rolled slowly toward the unstable pressure zone. Old security programming still active. One drone emitted a crackling voice warning through static. Unauthorized containment breach detected. Return subject V-12 to secure holding. Immediately, Ethan tightened his grip on the repair tool in his hand. Please tell me those things are not armed. Valeth remained perfectly still beside him. Not originally. The drones advanced another few feet. One extended an old restraint arm with a harsh mechanical click. Ethan's pulse quickened instinctively. Beside him, Valeth slowly lowered herself between Ethan and the approaching machines. Her shoulders straightened for the first time since he met her. Taller now. Stronger. Ancient instinct waking quietly beneath the fear. But when she spoke, her voice carried no anger at all. Only exhaustion. They never learned to stop chasing ghosts. Then the nearest drone accelerated suddenly toward them through the freezing corridor. The damaged drones rushed through the freezing corridor with grinding wheels and flashing red optics, their old programming trapped in an endless loop of containment orders. Ethan dropped to one knee beside the maintenance console and ripped the outer panel free while sparks crackled across the exposed circuitry. "I need that pressure seal closed now," he shouted over the alarms. Valeth stood several feet ahead of him between the drones and the failing corridor breach. The flashing emergency lights painted her dark skin crimson while cold air whipped through her silver hair in violent gusts. One of the drones extended its restraint arm toward her with a harsh metallic hiss. Subject V-12, the machine repeated through static. "Return to compliance." Ethan expected her to run or fight. Instead, Valeth slowly raised one hand toward the approaching machine. "Enough," she said quietly. Something changed in the corridor then. Ethan felt it immediately. Not sound. Pressure. The air itself seemed to vibrate softly around her voice. The nearest drone froze mid-motion. Its restraint arm twitched once before lowering slowly. The second machine rolled sideways into the wall like its navigation systems had suddenly failed. Ethan stared up from the exposed control panel. "What did you just do?" Valeth did not answer right away. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the drones as faint blue markings beneath her skin began glowing softly along her arms and throat. Not artificial light. Something alive. Ancient. "Solari navigators do not guide ships," she said at last. "We guide minds." Ethan blinked once. The station suddenly felt much smaller around them. One damaged drone emitted a burst of static before collapsing completely onto the frozen floor. The others retreated several feet down the corridor, optics flickering uncertainly. Valeth lowered her hand slowly. The blue glow beneath her skin faded again almost immediately, but Ethan noticed the exhaustion that followed it. Her breathing had become uneven beneath the emergency mask. "That ability," he said carefully. "The reports never mentioned it." A bitter sadness crossed her face. "The reports called it dangerous." Another violent tremor shook the station hard enough to throw Ethan against the maintenance panel. Warning sirens screamed louder now. The pressure seal indicator flashed bright red across the console. Critical failure imminent. Ethan forced himself back to work, reconnecting damaged relays with numb fingers while freezing wine tore through the lower sector tunnel. "If this blows," he muttered, "half the station loses atmosphere." Valeth moved beside him without hesitation and knelt near the damaged panel. Ethan noticed immediately how precise her movements became around machinery. Calm. Familiar. "You understand reactor systems?" he asked. "Navigation requires understanding energy flow." She reached carefully into the exposed circuitry and adjusted one cracked relay housing with surprising gentleness. This station was built on obsolete Terran architecture. The bypass sequence is reversed. Ethan stared at her for half a second before quickly shifting the relay alignment. The pressure indicator immediately stabilized by 3%. "Well," he breathed, "that would have been useful an hour ago." For the first time, Valeth smiled slightly. Tiny, brief, but real. Then every light in the corridor suddenly shifted from red to white. A calm automated voice echoed through the station. "Incoming authorized vessel detected. Command clearance Omega-7. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. That cannot be good. Valeth went, completely still beside him. All warmth disappeared from her expression in a single heartbeat. "They found me." The corridor monitors flickered to life overhead, displaying a dark military transport descending through the plasma storm outside Chiron 9. Black hull plating. Solari insignia etched across the side in silver markings. Ethan looked back toward her carefully. "Your people." Valeth's eyes lowered toward the frozen floor. "No," she whispered. "The ones who built this prison." Then the station intercom activated with a sharp burst of static. A man's voice filled every corridor. Calm, cold, familiar to her in ways Ethan understood immediately. "Subject V-12, the voice announced. Remain where you are. Retrieval team arriving shortly." Valeth's hands began trembling before she could stop them. The station fell strangely quiet after the announcement. Even the alarms seemed farther away now, drowned beneath the deep mechanical hum of the approaching transport outside. Ethan stood slowly from the maintenance console while cold air swept through the lower corridor around him. Across from him, Valeth had gone completely still. Her trembling hands closed tightly around the broken restraint chain hanging from her wrist as though she could force herself not to remember. Above them, the monitor feed shifted to an exterior camera view. The black Solari vessel descended through the blue plasma storm with unnatural precision, cutting through the turbulence like it had done this many times before. Ethan looked toward Valeth carefully. Who is he? Her eyes never left the screen. Director Malrek. Even saying the name seemed difficult. He oversaw this station. Ethan's jaw tightened. The man running experiments. Valeth lowered her head slightly. The man who said fear makes obedience easier. Silence settled heavily between them while the storm rumbled outside Chiron 9. Ethan looked down the frozen corridor toward the elevator shaft leading back to the detention deck. The station was damaged. Half the systems barely functioned. If that retrieval team boarded now, there would be nowhere to run. But when he looked back at Valeth, he realized something worse. She was already preparing herself to surrender. No, Ethan said quietly. Valeth blinked once. What? You are not going back there. Something fragile flickered across her face before disappearing again. You do not understand what they are capable of. Ethan stepped closer until only a few feet separated them in the freezing corridor. Maybe not, he admitted. But I know what this place turned you into. The station lights dimmed softly overhead. Valeth stared at him for a long moment, as if searching for the trap hidden beneath his words. There was none. Finally, she asked the question so quietly it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the storm. Why are you helping me? Ethan glanced toward the distant observation window where blue plasma clouds rolled endlessly across space beyond the damaged hull. Because every file on this station called you dangerous, he said. But none of them mentioned you stayed inside an open cell. Valeth's breathing caught slightly beneath the emergency mask. Ethan continued before she could look away. They called you unstable, violent, broken. His voice softened. But monsters do not warn people to stay back when the power fails. For the first time since he met her, Valeth's carefully controlled composure finally cracked. Not dramatically, just enough for Ethan to see the exhaustion underneath it all. Years of isolation, fear, silence. She lowered her eyes toward the floor while the blue storm light reflected softly across her skin. Above them, docking clamps thundered against the outer hull as the retrieval ship connected to Chiron 9. The station intercom crackled again. Retrieval team entering lower sectors. Ethan immediately reached for the emergency override panel beside the maintenance hatch and slammed his palm against the manual lock sequence. Heavy blast doors sealed shut across the corridor with a deafening metallic boom. Temporary. Maybe 5 minutes at best. Valeth looked at him in shock. You would stand against your own command for me? Ethan gave a tired smile beneath the flashing lights. Frontier security stopped feeling like command a long time ago. Another silence settled between them then. Smaller now. Warmer somehow despite the freezing air. Valeth stepped closer carefully until she stood directly in front of him. Ethan noticed the faint blue markings beneath her skin glowing softly again. Slower this time. Almost peaceful. Among my people, she whispered. Trust is not spoken. Before Ethan could answer, she gently lowered her forehead against his. The contact lasted only a second. Warm skin against cold exhaustion. A promise without words. Somewhere beyond the sealed blast doors, heavy footsteps echoed through the station. But for the first time since arriving on Chiron 9, Ethan no longer felt alone. Outside the observation window, the stars reflected in Valeth's golden eyes. And somehow, impossibly, they no longer looked cold.